Wait, before that, do both teams consent to being recorded?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't consent.
Okay, so opposition doesn't consent.
Oh wait, no, I do consent. We're not doing the minority motion. It's okay.
Okay, noted. Right, calling upon the Prime Minister, here.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Why do we have a backlash to cultural appropriation? We have a backlash because it represents people from a more privileged group now seeming edgy or innovative, or basically just taking credit for things that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, that represent the historic struggle of communities that's now getting washed away because now a white person thinks it's cool. I'm going to first characterize street food and then fine dining. I'm going to talk about why it's akin to cultural appropriation. And then we're also going to talk about how it literally locks out people who traditionally consume street food by jacking up the prices of the ingredients of those meals. So firstly, what does street food look like and why is it significant? Street food is generally very cheap because it tends to exist in poor segments of society that still have that street food culture. It has to be cheap to cater to that market. It also has to be quick and easy to make, since vendors in these markets don't tend to have the space nor the employee to have elaborate meals and things like that. Secondly, it just adds to the livability of these communities. That is to say, they face a lot of shit, but one of the glimmering hopes of happiness, one of the glimmering hopes that ties them to other people, is that they share the same food, that is easy, that's cheap, that's tasty, but also representative of the historic struggle that their community has faced. Now, what does it mean to be fine dining? Fine dining is necessarily prestigious. It's usually the most expensive, and it has to be the most expensive, because if your food isn't as expensive as the other fine dining place, then it's probably not as prestigious. It has to be aesthetic to appeal to that sense of prestige and appeal to the people that would pay the most for it. And therefore, it has the most social capital, because we live in a global capitalistic society that tends to value that. We live in a global society, and therefore media, and there tend to be more TV shows that focus on fine dining chefs. I mean, those fine dining chefs, their recipe books obviously get more coverage than the recipe books of someone who specializes in street food, right? So what does it mean when street food what does it mean fine dining appropriates street food? Firstly, they have to be made with fine dining ingredients, right? That is to say, they have to be made with topical ingredients that make it tasty, or at least presented in a way so that it seems like these ingredients are super good. So the ingredients have to be seen with a certain level of prestige. That's important for later. Secondly, it has to take long, because now you have a whole bunch of kitchens, and else it can't be so much sooner than all your other pristine fine dining food. And thirdly, right, it has to be expensive, because once again, fine dining restaurants thrive on the perception that they are pristine, and obviously pristine restaurants don't sell things for cheap. Right. And obviously, why would a chef do this? A chef does this because now a chef in fine dining can differentiate themselves from other fine diners. They can keep the image of fine dining, but now they're an edgy fine dining. Now they're going to have a viral Facebook clip of them turning this street food into a classy fine dining version of it, right? What this does is it strips the food of everything that made it meaningful. Note, street food evolved over hundreds of years in a way that reflects the history, the historic struggle of that people. And therefore, it tends to have certain ingredients that's indicative of that people. For example, a certain kind of tomato, you're talking about the street food of Italian or whatever, you know what I mean? Secondly, it obviously prepped without the kind of technology that exists today to indicate, to show, the historic struggle of these people. The fact that these people do face adversity and come from an environment that breed the cheap, quick street food that you see today. That means it's important because it's also a cultural tie. Just note, for example, that Malaysian street food is very similar to Singaporean street food. It's indicative of how those cultures have a cultural tie, even if borders now separate them. So now, whilst fine dining may be another evolution of street food, we say it's fundamentally wrong, because an evolution influenced by people who do not share that cultural literacy, who do not struggle in the way that the people who actually evolved it before did struggle, who often have it, yet often come from a different or / privileged race. For example, it might be like white people in America that want to be healthy and buy quinoa, or it even might be like someone from a higher caste in India enjoying the street food of lower caste Indian. Cool. How do they redefine it? Firstly, they use social capital to redefine it. By the now people see recipe that are influenced by fine dining, or they get expectations from TV. The broader population now see the original street food as wrong, or see it as like a cheaper, like inferior version of it, right? While the chefs are now seen as innovative, now get to capitalize on the theft that they've done of people who are far less privileged than themselves. The impact of that is, firstly, which you think is principally wrong, that those who are privileged get to basically like profit off the theft of those who are from a less privileged class. Note they already profit off their misery already, insofar they're born into privilege and they capitalize on it, but now they get to capitalize it further. Additionally, those from these cultures now have to deal with the fact that their special, unique street food is now generic. They have to deal with the fact that those from a more privileged background can act like, oh yeah, I know what that is. Like, I know just more about you. I know how to cook it properly. They have to deal with that bullshit that erodes what made it special and unique to their culture and indicative of their struggle. Before I go on about how this introduces prices, which in a very real sense locks out these people, I'm going to take a POI.
Not all chefs are white, so is it okay for a Chinese chef to pimp up Chinese street food like jianbing and make lots of money out of it?
Yeah, so we weren't just talking about white people, we were talking about people with more privilege. So the fact that you're probably a fine dining like cook means you're probably not someone who started off buying street food and started off making street food. It probably means you were someone from a more privileged member of that community. It could be someone from a higher caste in India, for example, now going into a lower caste place, taking street food, redefining it for the masses and getting all the credit for it. Now, what's the impact on prices? Firstly, obviously, the prices of the ingredients go up because there's just more demand. And there are now like restaurants, and now there are like, restaurants, etc., who are willing to pay more for it. Just note, for example, quinoa was literally a basic staple of South American diet. Now it's literally a delicacy. Now it's an expensive health food because white people in the West, see it as a health food and wanted to get on the crave. But secondly, and another reason why quinoa is more expensive is because sellers now have an incentive to increase the price to match the prestige. That is to say, for example, Kanye West, right, like wants his shoes to be more expensive and he'll sell less of those shoes as a result because having less of it around and having a higher price indicates prestige. It can capitalize on those who are willing to pay the most. Now, that means sellers of these ingredients have an incentive to also sell at a higher price because restaurants probably perceive that higher price as higher quality. So if you had to choose between selling at a lower price to people who can pay less or selling at a higher price to people who are willing to pay more, obviously you're going to choose to pay more. The impact of that is now the street food gets more expensive. So not only do they have to deal with the cultural appropriation, the absolute thievery, now they're literally locked out of the food that made their hello existence are just a little bit more bearable. Now they're locked out of the food once resembled or once showed the historical struggle, but now shows the thievery of more rich people. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech, calling upon the leader of opposition to start the case for opposition.
I can be heard, right?
Yes.
In the past, street food historically had a pretty bad reputation. And that's not because it was inherently bad. It's because it had a bad branding, right? Because rich people thought that street food was unhygienic, it was cheap, maybe wasn't as tasty compared to the medium rare steak that they kind of have. But what Danigan conveniently does for us is he actually explains all the mechanisms about why the prestige of street food goes up when he talks about supply and demand. He explains to us how the cultivators of that street food and the suppliers who make the ingredients for that street food now suddenly have a good revenue source from rich people because their prices go up and because, people are demanding those ingredients and all that kind of stuff. And he explains to us why street food gets a vast amount of exposure because literally their mechanism is like, well, now everyone's on the hype of this street food. That is why they lose this debate thoroughly. Firstly, in terms of setup, the first thing to say here is that street food is perceived as cheap and quick to produce and ready to eat and all that kind of stuff. But empirically, that is not the case for most forms of street food. Street food is usually very labor intensive and experience focused. There, as Daniken says, techniques perfected over thousands and thousands of generations or whatever. And they usually have a number of subtleties. The exact timing at which you lift the wok out of the pot, the exact balance of flavors of the different spices that you might put into that pot. The fact that handmade noodles have a nuance of flavors in them because there is uniqueness in how they are formed by the hands, which is different to the way that a machine generically produces them, which is why we all love our mums cooking, because there is some subtlety there that you cannot find if a MasterChef Michelin star Gordon Ramsay guy just like replicated what your mum made on a pot. And you have those locally sourced ingredients. Wagyu beef in Japan tastes very, very different to beef in Australia or beef in America and all that kind of stuff. That's the first piece of setup. The second piece of setup is that the consumers of street food and fine dining do not actually, in most cases, intersect, because people who go for fine dining are usually very rich and do not live in the areas that street food are produced and have a lot more money to afford fine dining and all that kind of stuff. And they have the different perceptions about hygiene and all that kind of stuff. And there's wealth disparities. They have different reservation prices. What this means is that in the worst case scenario of our case, say none of our mechanisms are achieved, there's no actual real big pragmatic harm because the consumers of that fine dining are not the ones that are taking money from the street food anyway, right? So they're not the ones that are buying street food anyway. Those actors do not intersect. But what we will prove in our case is that we'll make them intersect in a positive way. We'll allow people in street food careers to go up to fine dining careers, and we'll allow people who currently consume fine dining to appreciate that street food. So first argument about how we improve street food culture. Firstly, what we do is that we make street food far, far more prestigious. And we do this in several ways. Firstly, we break stereotypes of street food, right? Street food is often seen as unhygienic and cheap and, low quality. But when you put it on a plate, when you put it behind chefs and stories, that breaks those stereotypes. Secondly, you harness the machine of restaurant capitalism because restaurants have an intrinsic incentive to knuckle down and focus on the authenticity of and the quality of the food. They have celebrity chefs making this. They'll have well-written English descriptions. They have Michelin star restaurants promoting this. And their incentive is to promote the authenticity of this food. And thirdly, there's just general exposure because you have a set of consumers who otherwise would not consume street food, now consuming street food at least on a fine dining plate. And this generates three very important benefits. Firstly, you just get more people into street food because the problem with fine dining is that obviously they make good versions of street food, but it is usually generic. It is usually like very small size and portions and leaves you wanting for more. And you can get a large portion of street food, which is not that generic and super authentic, which is presumably what the white people are chasing, authenticity, from the actual street food vendors, right? Which means that a lot of people have structural incentives to now also, now that they know that there's that street food, go to those vendors, right? And that's really good for those street food markets because those street food markets are usually low SES in background and have a number of different minority communities. We inject capital into that community when people are into it. But also, there's a set of actors who have limited capital and only fine dine occasionally, right? So for instance, some people might fine dine on their birthday, and then they might say, buy Korean fried chicken done really well. But the problem there is they don't actually have the capital to keep fine dining. So when they like that food, once they've been exposed and interested in it, what they're likely to do is go to the street food substitutes and enjoy that instead. Secondly, we generally get more exposure to different cultures and all that kind of stuff in restaurants, which is really good for like contact theory and all that kind of stuff. We exacerbate this effect through the fact that restaurants have incentive to talk about the culture and the history of the dish and the race that it comes from. Thirdly, we make a huge impact on zoning laws. This sounds logistical, but is an actually massive impact. If you look at it like a city like Sydney, right? The only time you can find street food markets is on one day, on Friday, and there are 15 stalls there because there is a limited zone in which those street food markets can establish. And the reason why there's no political capital to expand that currently is because there is a huge stigma against street food. At the point at which we increase the prestige of street food and increase the demand for street food, that means councils are more likely to increase the zoning laws and have more areas in which you can establish those street food stalls, which means we have more livelihoods who can actually make a living out of producing street food. If you look at Taiwan, you'll have a kilometer of street food stalls, like thousands of street food stalls, and that's something that we want to promote more under our side. Before I continue, I would like to take a point of information.
Street food is a unique intersectional culture between class, poor, poverty, and race, whatever identity you subscribe to. Why would these people want to clean it up to begin with?
It's not about cleaning it up. They already think their street food is super clean and super cool. The problem is that on your side, people don't have that perception. We change that perception. So secondly, how do we help individuals? Because as I explained, there is an incentive for the chase of authenticity. It means one, you're more likely to employ people from the minority background. Like no one's going to go to a white restaurant to eat like kimbap or something. Like that just does not happen on your side. Obviously, people want to go to a Korean restaurant with a rich Korean chef because that is something that gives them the feeling of authenticity. If they don't employ them, they'll at least consult with them, or they'll go to those suppliers, which means we get a great capital injection. We lower the barriers of entry for people to get into those careers. And it means that those chefs can get a career, they can open up their restaurants, they can promote street food. Lastly, in terms of cultural appropriation, because we explained that the incentive is for authenticity, that means we compensate those people for, like we employ those people or we pay them in consultation. So we compensate the people for using their culture, which is not theft, but it is compensation. But even if a particular chef, like importantly, no particular chef owns a style of food. If we can compensate the community by making their quality of life better, by having more street food stores and at making their culture more prestigious, we largely fulfill that burden. For these reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for that speech, calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case for
The plate is a shrine which connects me to my past. The dumplings which sit on bottom, passed down from my grandmother, the food that I eat, the food that we all eat, what we think that that food is, the result of history, long come and long past. We say that to sever that history, to take away what was once traditionally our culture, replace it with something designed for the palates of those of elsewhere, to replace them by people creating food, using technologies that we don't think are right, using technologies that are vastly different, is a wrong to society. Because in much the same way that if we were presented a burger and someone had like replaced all of the meat and all of the the buns with like pasta, we would think that that's not a burger anymore. To call that a burger is an insult to food. We would think that if we had a jianbing and we replaced the wheat little like pancake thing and instead we just wrapped it in a taco shell, I would think that that is wrong. I would say that if you cooked a dumpling and you made it open faced and you put it on top of a plate and it's like open concept dumpling or whatever the shit, I would think that you are off your rocker and that you are spitting on the ways that I've made food for centuries. I say that the evolution of food is special. I say that the culture surrounding food is special. I say that street food is special because it is born of poverty. We ought to protect that which what it was made. First, let us understand the import and value of what cultural appropriation means in this debate, right? Because I just told you it is a tragedy every time we as people forget where our roots came from. Because when we pass down the story of we have Bowser were originally invented because they were meant to mimic the head of somebody, and then some asshole comes along not understanding that or thinking that it'll sell better if we just change it slightly and like reinvent the concept. I think that that's a spit in the face of the stories that led to the creation of that food. But also I think that teaching a bunch of people alienated from the culture and unlikely to experience authenticity, but this is what it looks like, makes life harder for both people who want to protect that authenticity and also means that like you are essentially stripping away one of the stories. We would not support a world where somebody else from above us gets to rewrite the culture and myths that make up our traditional stories. Why are we letting them rewrite what our food looks like? And we tell you, here's how. Fine dining usurps the image of what food is. First, we told you again at the very specific reasons of why they have incentives to change these things, right? That because of the nature of street food is basically completely antithetical to what fine dining is. The most amazing and obvious one is literally street food is designed to be eaten in your hand or very quickly in like out of small bowls and such, not designed to be part of a fine dining experience where you eat it with cutlery. As a result, when you redesign to be able to serve these things on plates, you necessarily make fundamental changes to the way that we consume this food. And what that does is it usurps the image of what it is, and it means that people unfamiliar with that culture will not have an accurate read of that culture, which is wrong. How does it do that? First, obviously, if you're going to say, for example, talk about like fame and like ability to project advertising and that sort of stuff, their side is the side that manages to get the word out about what jianbing is. Their side is the side that gets to talk about what dumplings are meant to look like. And furthermore, beyond that, there's also the side that gets to set the recipes for everyone, right? Because if you see, like, if you're searching up a recipe for dumplings and you see one that's being made by a 5-star Michelin chef guy and another one that's just made by like Uncle Joe, you're probably going to follow the one with like the 5-star Michelin chef guy, which means that over time, as people grow up and grow around these food cultures that have radically changed what the food previously was and meant, we will get a radically wrong definition of what this food should be, which, as I've already pointed to you, is in and of itself, a damage that we accrue towards society. But also, I think that they're like wonderful kumbaya image of rushing people to markets to achieve traditional food also locks out the people who traditionally want to eat that food, locks people out of creating the authentic versions of that food. Before I move on to that, I'll take a POI.
So when I go to China, there are restaurants there and they can make food and put it on a plate. I don't understand why cultures have to lock themselves to eating out of their hands.
So debates occur in a world where we must talk about what one thing changing can impact another thing, right? Obviously, in a world where we're primarily talking about fine dining of the Western like assholes, that is wrong for them, and they primarily work on a Western scale, then the impacts of where they're achieved is going to be street food vendors in Sydney, as you mentioned. But also, to the extent that Chinese fine dining hotel chefs are also redefining what street food means in China, but I think that the definition that we work with also applies. And I think what I want you to remember about like why all of this is wrong, even in spite of the fact they say like Chinese Americans like do the redefinitions and such. It's like even if they weren't for the fact they were ultra high privilege, the other reason to step in the evolutionary chain is wrong is because they are catering to a completely different audience, right? That fine dining is catering to people who have lots of money, are willing to sit down, are willing to pay shit tons out the ass for like fancy food, which means that the way that you change that food is fundamentally different to the way that, say, like if grandma passes the recipe down to me as a street food vendor, I would change that food to sell the street food in a slightly more effective way to my modern audience. That means it's still in the same vein of what the evolution should look like and not completely divorced from reality. So to the extent that, yes, we think that high-class Chinese chefs redefining what dumplings is within China, those examples that are relevant there also apply here. And we think that it does definitely affect the way that traditional owners and makers of these food are able to consume and eat this. How so? First, if you rush a bunch of people to market and they have their own mechanism, like, oh, you want to eat more of the food, so you're going to go find the authentic sources, obviously you're going to have basic expectations set by the fine dining chefs as to what that food looks like, right? So for example, you probably will expect higher class ingredients than they're willing to provide. We're probably going to expect as a result of fine dining, I don't think anybody in fine dining is just serving you like a big slab of fried dough, right? Because it's not hot culture, it's not healthy, it's not like, fancy to have like a big slab of like fried dough and sprinkle sugar on top and make it all greasy and delicious. To the extent that that means that when you get presented the very radically different way of what authentic food looks like, you reject it and you say, no, I don't want this. Street food vendors are then under pressure to change their recipes, right? Because if they want to capture all of this large group of people coming in, then they obviously want to have to readapt their recipes to be able to make it so that it sells to what people expect it to be. And to the extent that we told you, fine dining literally advertises itself and tries to set itself as the standard that you should try and make food at, we think that that is wrong. Firstly, because it means that all the people who want to eat traditional food probably aren't as numerous because they are minorities and because they are going to have less money compared to the like economic capital of all the rich, haughty white people coming in to buy this shit, means that they're going to be outcompeted and everybody's going to split to making these sorts of food. Or if they do not, they go out of business, which would you change more and more and more of the history and our culture from a radically different thing. But also, they do nothing in response to the fact that we told you. Just the sheer fact of popularizing this food means that you start raising the prices. So that means the vendors who sell these things no longer sell to the same clientele. It means that people who wanted to buy it don't get to eat it. It also means the ingredients used to make it are so much more expensive. I think that we all protect our culture.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, calling upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case for opposition.
Can it be heard?
Yes.
Awesome stuff. James gives quite a beautiful introduction about the cultural roots of Chinese food, but there is a big problem to it, which is just that authentic pork and chive dumplings exist, as does the deconstructed dumplings made of liquid nitrogen. They exist in both worlds, and you can get the both worlds for the very reason that I can get my pork and chive you can get your pork and chive dumplings, and I can get mine carved in the beautiful shape of a lotus. And the simple reason is different people have different spending capitals, different people have different tastes, and that is why a market for both is likely to exist, and the absolute destruction of street food simply because fine dining does some experimentation and tries to integrate it into its food culture will not destroy it. That is why the first question I'm going to ask is cultural appropriation a sufficient harmful side affirmative to win this debate? The answer will be no, but let's explain why. Because firstly, cultural appropriation is only bad insofar as it is considered theft and communities do not get compensated for what has been taken from them. So for example, a white woman getting a henna tattoo from a white woman without any consideration of the cultural roots from India is problematic because those who derive their livelihood from it are getting no benefit in any way or form. However, a white woman who goes to Japan and puts on a kimono because they rented it from a local kimono shop is not cultural appropriation. It is appreciation because they're funding local businesses and injecting capital in a way in which is respectful and in a way which shows different degrees of cultural interaction, and we think that's largely good. So we give you many reasons as to why communities are sufficiently compensated in a world where fine dining incorporates the norms of street foods. Because firstly, we tell you where even chefs who are not from the background of the foods in which they're taking inspiration from, they're able to compensate minorities for a few structural reasons. Firstly, because authenticity is capital in fine dining, because you want to seem like you're paying respects and paying homage to the people in which you gain inspiration from. You're likely to have detailed kind of illustrations about the history of this sort of food and the ingredients which have gone into it. Secondly, we tell you you're likely to also just hire minorities because minorities are familiar with the profiles of flavors they're using, the ingredients they're using, and the techniques they're using, which therefore means there is an incentive to hire more of these people in order to not only make it seem authentic, but also to make your food better. The third here is that they have more expertise. And the fourth thing is that at worst, often these restaurants operate in consultation with minority groups in particularly positive ways. Jocks on Frio is a Scottish guy who uses native Australian ingredients at his restaurants, and he did so in consultation with local Indigenous communities and also created a non-profit database which documented these ingredients. People like Ren Redzepi, the Noma, spent years with Latin American communities to understand how to use the local ingredients so he could properly run a pop-up, a pop-up kind of restaurant which advocated and promoted these ingredients. It is obviously done often in a more respectful way because the consequences of cultural appropriation are far more damaging to the restaurant because you're seen as a poser, because you're seen as some elitist who just stole from these cultures. It is something which is incredibly heavily criticized, which is why there are incentives to be respectful. And at the point where that is true, it is beneficial for a few reasons. The second thing we then tell you here is that the collapse of boundaries between fine dining and street food means that people who otherwise would not have consumed street food when they went to Indonesia and are far likely wanting to try things like nasi goreng and nasi lemak and the foods which currently exist there. That was obviously good because at the point where that is true, they want to try the original dish because the fine dining one gives them a taste of what it could be. It is small portions, it is Moorish, but you want to see what the local people actually ate. Is an injection of capital into these communities at a grassroots level and a benefit to these communities there. So therefore, the improvements to, even at the end of the day, the improvements to food, to street food culture is a trade-off we're willing to cop to the extent that maybe there is some degree of cultural appropriation, but we think it is largely fine and largely done in a respectful manner. But lastly, the thing to note here is that there are Danigan's inability to address my pure why I say, what about Chinese people who try to popularize street foods in fine dining forms? Surely that is okay. And his response is, well, they're really privileged. That is one asserted. And also, secondly, deeply unlikely to be true for the very fact that if you're privileged, you weren't going to become a chef. You had a university degree and now you're working a shitty white collar job and earning money at a shitty corporate law firm, which as a result probably is like, different people go into different things. But the problem here is it does not address the principal push behind my claim, which is just that if a minority wants to move from street food into fine dining, there's obviously a fine path because there's a way in which I want to disseminate the complexity and rich cultural history of their foods. That was likely to be beneficial. And perhaps the way they climbed out is they worked for some white chef for 5 years, but then they split off and had their own restaurants. That was incredibly meaningful for their community and able for them to demonstrate kind of respect for the culture, but also to stand on their own feet in ways which you thought were incredibly positive. James then tells us in their most recent speech that there is a dissemination harm. The perception of what fine dining street food looks like becomes what all street food looks like. So now you get deconstructed dumplings or something like that. But the problem with that argument is just that it is empirically untrue for a few reasons. Because firstly, fine dining does not have the social cachet of regular food for the very reason that it is deemed as elitist. It is deemed as not what food actually looks like in the first place. For example, the popular conception of a burger is still bun, meat, lettuce, cheese, bun, not some shit which Heston Blumenthal pulls out and puts into like liquid nitrogen. So that therefore means the ability of street food for fine dining to define what we think cultural street foods are is deeply unlikely. We have popular conceptions of what curry looks like. We have popular conceptions of what dumpling looks like. Just because some people put it into fine dining doesn't change those ingrained conceptions which have already been disseminated and already inculcated in what people think these foods are in the first place. I'll take a POI now. Danigan?
So obviously there's more buyers and sellers. So why is driving up the prices of their food and that's cutting into their discretionary income?
That's my second issue. So I'm going to deal with that after I finish this bit of weighing. So also at the end of the day, David gives you very clever preemptive responses where he says, at worst, under our side, street food cultures will not be affected because to the extent that maybe it is quite a marginal debate in that the kind of poorest transition between these kind of food worlds is like rich people now having street food. In the end where rich people do not have street food, one, you don't get your harms of price hikes, but also two, the consumers of street food still exist because that is what they eat in a local basis. So the second thing I'm going to do in this speech and explain why price hikes do not occur. Because firstly, Danigan's economics is a little bit odd here because price hike only goes up if supply cannot keep up with demand. So at the point where there are heaps of street food vendors, it is deeply unlikely that prices are going to go up substantially. And it is likely for a few reasons, because firstly, there just are multiple street food vendors if you go to places in Taiwan, if you go to places in Indonesia. But secondly, we think this is even better because it incentivizes states to not do shitty zoning laws, which gets rid of street food vendors. They're far more likely to subsidize them because it is a part of the kind of tourism industry and are able to inject, you're out of order. Right, that's you, Jeremiah, what the fuck? And able to inject more money into that was bad. Able to inject more money into the economy, which therefore means they don't implement problematic zoning laws, which get rid of food stores, and they're also far more likely to promote it as a place where people should probably pursue these careers and pursue their cultural backgrounds, which therefore means we don't think the economic or commercial incentives is going to drive things up. And even if we did, it was probably likely to be separated into price hierarchies, which is to say there's maybe some more expensive street food, but there's also quite cheap street food because they're appealing to different demographics. Some rich people like the more expensive stuff. Some people who can't afford it will still eat the cheaper stuff. Street food will not be hurt. That is why we win this debate.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. To conclude the substantive case for government will.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, so I actually do prefer cameras on, waving hands, give me faces and everything like that, and I'll take a PY2 audio, but I'm going to use the bathroom and I'll leave my notes here so you know that I'm not cheating. Am I audible? Oh, great. Thumbs up. Tech. So here's how government's going to win. And this is different from all my other speeches because I'm an Asian speaker. I like to scream and shout and yell, but I think this particular thing is a bit serious and a bit emotional. So let's go into that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about cultural preparation. We're going to talk about the metrics that came up within CAT speech and show you why we're able to take those metrics to its finals and why we're able to win this. The second thing we're going to do is going to show you why economically you just lock these people out and don't give them the same levels of opportunities. Insofar as we win these two key premises, we're able to move forward. But I think my POIs that were unanswered really need to take hold. This debate about street food isn't just about some random person who is Indian or some random person who is, I don't know, Malay or Chinese or anything like that. The issue comes with street food is the idea that in certain areas or within countries during post-conflict regions, the reason why we wanted to do this is because these people were poor. They could not afford food, they could not figure things out, they could not find resources, and they could not find supplies. So people within these communities came together, they built up a culture, they built up foods, they built up things that brought them together, and they put it down into a piece of plate that you can eat around and you can walk away with. Right now, that culture is being appropriated everywhere. They say, well, it's technically respect to the culture. Technically, you have Chinese people working within these areas, you have them benefiting off. I think there are three questions we need to answer. One is whether or not this is something that's true or authentic in all circumstances. Insofar as that there is going to be white chefs there. There are going to be people who prepare this food who don't do it the same because it just cannot be replicated. There are going to be circumstances where it is different. And insofar as that is true, the second question we ask is who profits and benefits of this? Because the question then becomes is compensation and apt metrics when cultural appropriation can occur. Because can you really just buy out that entire culture and buy out the entire experience with a check to one person that you like, or because you spent 5 years in India and therefore you understand it or you know what it is like? That is the question that needs to linger in your mind. That is the question you need to answer. Because you can't buy it and you can't do what they want to do. There are two argumentations they can't push forward in terms of this type of things. This is also echoed within David's speech. The first thing they say is, well, compensation is something that exists. Let's take that. The first thing they will tell you in terms of compensation is that in the majority of cases, it does not exist, right? In the majority of cases, sometimes it's just white chefs going within rural areas and finding out these type of things. So when you go to Indonesia and you go and find all your niche of aunties who start cooking off from this, literally cooking out from their homes and coming in, for example, selling their food, that is what authentic street food looks like. That is not the people they hire within your areas. That is not the people who buy into these type of things, and that is not what it looks like in comparison to that. I.e., these people never go out towards these things. Even if it is, I'm going to tell you that it's probably just very coercive towards these individuals. It just doesn't happen. But more importantly, the bigger question is, fuck it, let's just say these things are true. But then the question becomes, how long does it last? How long does it take for a chef to go forward and say that, well, we hire certain individuals and so on? The moment you understand the recipe, the moment you know what it is, the moment you can replicate it, you can move forward. They say that authenticity is what a chef wants to push forward. That's not true. They want profit. They want reputation. It means insofar as they can show, hey, I spent time here. This is my niche. Look at me. I'm really pretty because I wear this culture as a headrest on my throat. And that is what they want to be able to propagate. And the moment they're able to fix that reputation, the moment they don't have to hire the individuals, the moment they can fire them, they do. Because fine dining is a niche field. In majority of cases, it requires you to have a culinary degree. It is a resource locked out that literally any poor individual has never been able to buy into. But more importantly, within developing nations, it just was something that just never existed until it was brought on them towards that. Bringing these foods there, in and of itself, is a cultural appropriation that exists. So that means compensation is one that cannot exist. But two, even if it does, it's probably coercive. Even if it's not coercive, you can't just buy out an entire culture because you pay one or two individuals, because the culture is more than just those individuals. It's about the lived experience for specific communities. They're located in specific areas that you cannot pull out of these type of things. The second thing they then say is that, well, as long as you're able to do so, that means also the incentive structure towards these type of things also falls. The second thing they then say is that the cultural appropriation metrics then does not apply because you're able for some levels to respect the cultures that exist on the ground. And I think it's simple. Street food is not something that you can have in fine dining foods. Fuck the whole order of these things, fuck the whole nitrogen gas and everything. That just, by the way, if that just exists, it is just wrong. And the fact that you call it nasi lemak, the fact that you call it all these type of things is cultural appropriation itself. Make your own foods, do your own things, don't take up my label, because taking up their label is wrong. It means why can't I have the nitrogen thing and just not call it like whatever the fuck you want to call it, right? These things are alternatives. They don't. They call it that because they market it as that. Because it is the niche, it is their want, it is what they want to push forward because they can use you to be able to make profit. The second thing you then say is that even if they don't, even if it's the most respectful thing ever, let's just say they really go and ferment the coconut milk that they want to make nasi lemak with, or they really do dig up the spices because they planted at home in your grandma's backyard. Let's just say they do that. The palatability changes when you go into fine dining, right? The flavors can no longer maintain its level of authenticity because the market in which you cater to no no longer buys into that same level of ideas. And more importantly, you also want to see more unique than what is available there, right? The fact is, if you serve a literal food that you can get from a stalker uncle like at the side of the road, it is not something that's going to be bought into by other people because you don't have that same level of development. All of these things means that compensation is not only unjust, improbable, and not short-term in nature and unfavorable. Even if it does, it is in every case cultural appropriation that exists. A cultural appropriation exists within these areas, and even if it's not, you're literally buying into this. Notice in terms of material, what does this come up? We told you, A, the cultural appropriation exists on a couple of metrics. The first metric we tell you that is not authentic towards the nations. The fact that you want to clean up this food to begin with is a cultural appropriation in of itself. I don't want my culture to be perceived as clean, David. I don't want them to look at me and think, well, this particular things are nice, our new ones are really pretty. I want them to like me for my authentic self. And if they can't, and if they need, for example, different versions of myself to buy into it, that is not versions that I want to buy into. And that is the definition of cultural appropriation. The second thing is the whole misrepresent things. The third thing is, even if we gatekeep all these type of things, it is good because they all belong to these communities. Someone has a PY, I think. I said audio, but yeah. No? All right, great. Moving forward, the second argumentation that we're going to push forward towards you is why economically this push this up. The first thing they then say is, well, when you increase supply, you increase demand, yada, yada, yada. I agree. But the question becomes, where do street vendors place in this, right? That means when street vendors are no longer the main supplier, main individuals who buy into these type of things, you can price discriminate against street vendors. You can start increasing the price because you want to cater towards fine dining. You also have multiple people who buy into these popularities. Like you have individuals on the ground who want to start buying into these things and you change the demand. That means in the short term, you radically increase prices because your supply can't keep up. And in the long term, you use price discrimination to keep up with these type of, to keep up with the trends and amps. But more importantly, the short-term harm is the one that I can definitely prove, and we have already told you so far. That short-term harm is already enough to kill off a lot of vendors because all you need to do is lose up a couple of revenues a week, lose up a couple of revenues a month, and then it's dead. The last thing that we then tell you is that the conclusion of all of this is simple. In our world, you have some level of authenticity. If you want to buy into the culture, you're able to do so. In their world, you have white chefs that come in to buy and purchase these type of identities. They portray it as really pretty because they want to make money. They change the recipe to cater towards palates. They do nitrogen and everything else because they want to create a level of change. But more importantly, they do all of this by saying that we are helping your community and we're making it better to a community that simply just wanted to be left alone. I say call your food whatever it wants, but don't use my culture as a label for your restaurants.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech, calling upon the opposition whip to conclude the substantive portion for ops.
When you are deliberating in this debate, or for this debate rather, you need to engage with how the teams interacted with others' paradigms. They told us cultural appropriation was the most important thing. We told you enriching culture and enriching communities and removing the zoning laws that restrict people to have a business was important. Maximizing people's dreams were important. They never engaged with all of the stuff that we gave you, nor did they weigh their material against ours. We were the only ones who ever engaged in that weighing when we told you that actually there is something more important when it comes to a life, and that is being able to live that life. The material about culture and cultural preservation, that is subsequent to all of the benefits we provide you, which is a maximization of businesses, a maximization of dreams, and a maximization of money and capital into these communities. That's the most important thing. It is the prerequisite to all culture, because if you didn't live your life, nor your community, nor your children, nor your family lived a life that was able to be enriched, then it was unlikely that culture was going to be a significant consideration for you. A few issues. Firstly, on the principle, They claim that the principle is that cultural appropriation is the most important thing and that this is pretty bad for cultural appropriation. A few things to say. Firstly, this does not cause cultural appropriation because cultural appropriation is theft, as Kat describes to you. It is very unlikely that this will be theft of that culture and of the foods that are made in the street. There is an incentive that we give you as to why these culinary fine diners want to recognize the original culture, because authentic Chinese food is much better than just saying like rice in a plate. Like obviously there's an incentive to pin or to reference the people from whom these foods came from. Obviously cultural appropriation might be bad in some instances because it harms people, but to the extent that you're recognizing the people from whom it came from, it is unclear if it actually leads to the cultural appropriation that they are talking about. The other thing to say is that we told you that there's a consultation mechanism, which means we'll consult with the communities as to how to best execute this food, because when there are other fine diners who are able to also engage with those street food vendors, they are going to be more authentic. They are going to fully understand how to make those noodles. And you need to employ the people who have been making the street food for a long time, and you need to employ them for quite a considerable amount of time because they are the ones who already have the skills of how to make the noodles in that specific way. They understand the skills on how to fry that specific food in that particular way. So it is an incentive to employ and to consult with those people and to engage in discussions with those communities. Additionally, we would say that society is already on a trajectory to recognize those types of foods. They never gave us an example of which particular foods have been appropriated except quinoa. Like quinoa exists on a lot of continents, so it didn't really make much sense for that to be culturally appropriated. I think a lot of people know what kimchi is, they know what kimbap is, and it is an incentive to recognize when you are using that type of food. But secondly, even if cultural appropriation occurs, we think that financial and cultural enrichment is more important than preserving culture. Why? A, because people do not consent to disadvantage and a lack of enrichment under the opposition side. No one consented to the fact that the country is restricting the amount of vendors because it is not seen as, because the street food is not seen as useful for the economy. So people are disadvantaged under their side, but you never consented to that. But you did consent to giving food to people and letting them eat and taste and imbibe in your culture. And it's not as if cultural communities are angry when white people make their food. In fact, in some communities, for example, for the Nigerian community in Australia, it's quite something to be celebrated when people who are not part of your culture can make it and can acknowledge that it was your food. But B, we don't know if cultural appropriation is a high moral in this debate, because our moral is to enrich these communities and to enrich individuals who want to enter into culinary profession. That is a more certain moral in terms of enriching people, because all policies and debates should be about making people's lives and quality of life better. Their morality is about protecting culture, but those cultures had stolen from one another in the past before as well. Chinese culture that had like dumplings in one region was colonized by another part of Chinese culture which co-opted those dumplings, and that is the same for a vast amount of cultures. We do not believe that this cultural appropriation morality should be the be-all and end-all, because it's uncertain morality. Ours is certain in its morality. The next thing that they say is that inclusion bastardizes the food and bastardizes the stories. Firstly, who cares if it has bastardized the story? Because that is deeply uncomparative. You never told us why it was important to maintain a story over the zoning laws that restrict your family from being able to earn an income and bring food to your table and educate your children. You never proved why a story was more important than enriching the streets and providing capital for the youth who have a usually high amount of crime, but now could it be employed at a street food stand because there are more of them. You never proved that this was in protecting a story that was once nebulous and past is more important than a person who wants to take their food to a culinary cuisine place and be able to like disseminate that and earn lots of money from that. They never did any of that weighing, and we told you our weighing is more important, and we did the weighing, which was that this is more concrete, it is more certain, and it is more moral to the extent that we are actually able to improve people's lives. I'll take a point.
Yeah, okay. Street food vendors probably outnumber haute cuisine diners like 100 to 1. How many of them could you possibly hire to pay off the theft of their culture?
you didn't respond to the material that we gave you as to why it's not a theft of their culture. But secondly, even if it's a theft of their culture, you're still repaying them to eat food. Like, what good is your culture if you do not have an education, or if you're likely to die because you do not have the access to food or shelter? Second issue in this speech, how does inclusion enrich the disadvantaged? Two sub-issues here. Firstly, on enriching disadvantaged communities, they claim that this increases the price of ingredients. Kat eviscerates this argument, but we also say this is very unlikely because it's an elastic good, meaning that if it is true that you hike up the prices of this ingredient, no one's going to buy it. That's a massive loss to the people who are hiking up the price. But additionally, they say, oh, people demand something new from the street vendors, so the street vendors have nothing to offer. This is a lie, because kimchi is tasty and people still continue to eat foods that tasted before. They then claim that you can't compete with fine dining. Also a lie, because your prices are cheaper. So at the conclusion then, what happens to individual communities? Firstly, we remove the zoning laws or reduce them because countries understand that this is a massive influx of money and enrichment to the community and the financial and the economy of the country. Secondly, we also have like street customers going from fine diners. For example, maybe you're a mum who's just taking your kids to go fine dine, but you don't have a lot of money. Now you want to keep eating that food, so you go to the street vendors who can offer it for cheaper price. That means that we give a mechanism for how these communities are improved. They at the conclusion here, what we've done is that we've actually proven the more important thing in the debate, which is improving people's lives. They've just protected a story, but they never told us if that story was actually the story of like a singular person, and that story should be hoarded and gatekept. Why would you gatekeep your ability to live a happy and better life?
I thank the op-whip for that speech, calling upon the opposition advice speaker to conclude the case for opposition.
I can be heard, right?
Right.
Awesome. Rosie tells the story of post-conflict states, of impoverished minority communities that got together the sticks and stones that they had. They had no money, they had no suppliers, but they set up a community of street stalls, and therefore their culture is important. But that's missing a link, because the immediate concern of these people is not their long and established history. It's how do they feed their children? How do they get customers? How do they get money in their pocket? The person who makes the dumpling could not care less about their culture. They just want to make as much money as possible. They want to feed their children. And what their side does is that their side structurally oppresses their ability to do so. Because firstly, we explain that the customers that they have are currently the poorest ones who cannot pay them a lot of money, as opposed to a richer clientele that we introduced into their market. We tell you, secondly, from my speech, that their food intersects with other axes of oppression due to that negative perception. In the same way that white people often place this unfair expectation on Indian people that they smell because they eat curry or something like that, which is totally unfair and totally a perception that should be changed. But thirdly, the idea that we tell you again and again to no response that states trap them, because when they're hid behind the stigma and privilege, they lock them behind zoning laws which prevent them from operating and living their livelihoods. In Sydney, in Chinatown, there are 15 stalls on one day of the week. And this is an example I given first. Imagine if we could have 200, 300, 1,000 stalls where we can lift the stigma and we can have better customer bases for all those people. That is hundreds of people that can now live the dream that Rosie talked about in their third speaker speech. And that is why we win the debate. But let's talk about appropriation more specifically, because the first thing I want to point out is that the open-faced dumplings and the burger with pasta filling that James talked about literally does not exist, because we are supporting the status quo. And we are supporting a status quo with a set of structural incentives that I explain in my speech. Incentives to import that culture in a way which is legitimate. Incentives to promote that culture in a way which is expressive. Incentives to not look like a white bitch like they agree is bad and everyone in society agrees is bad, and employ people of that culture and consult with people of that culture. And importantly, their use of the logic of cultural misappropriation is a very arbitrary application of that principle. Because if you had say a Chinese person that had a food stall, and then you had another poor Chinese person set up a food stall next to them, technically they're thieving from them because they're setting up competition, but under their logic, that's not appropriation. But however, if a white person sets up a fine dining establishment in a different part of the city with a complete different set of customers, and they actually compensate you because they hire you for your expertise and all that, and they promote your culture, somehow that is theft. Just completely illogical. But I guess the best push from Rosie is the idea that we get from Rosie at third is that, well, the benefit you get is only temporary because they'll pay you in the short term and they'll fire you and all that kind of stuff. That ignores the hidden benefit I explained in my first speaker argument, which is that the real benefit isn't just the dollars that you pay to that person for hiring them or for giving you your recipe, is a long-term exposure and promotion of your street food culture and of your street food vendors that you get when they attract customers to your street food store, when they expose that your food is something which is cool and something you should buy and purchase. And essentially, maybe they're not paying them in a monetary sense, but they're paying them in form of advertising. And if you know anything about modern day capitalism, that is definitely a benefit which is very long-term and very substantial in our case. Then James gives a POI, which is like, well, there's more street food than there's fine dining, so the compensation can never match, which I think is a pretty smart POI, but it also runs into Kat's logic, which is that at the point at which there will always be more street food diners, Kat explains in her speech, that is why street food will always have cultural dominance of what is expected about this food, of what this food is likely to be, and what this food is likely to be called. At the end of the day, fine dining was never there to replace, and never could replace street food, but they could supplement it, they could promote it, and they could benefit the livelihoods of these people. And that is where we are very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Aubrey Clay, for that speech, calling upon the government reply to conclude the case for Gov as well as the grand finals.
All right, let's rock and roll in 3, 2, 1. What happened in this debate is we tried to teach debaters about the fact that the world can be more than just cost-benefit analysis, that there can be value to culture, that there can be value to intangible things, and it blew Jerry's mind so bad, I think he POI'd his own member. I'm sorry, that was a joke. No, nothing intended against you, Jerry. So let's understand then why we don't think that we're sufficiently able to prove that the sticker price they were trying to auction off culture at was worthwhile, why we think that they don't do sufficient responses to the damage that you would accrue towards these culture, and finally, why we just think as a general rule, we ought to value and prioritize this culture in general. So first, what do they offer in exchange for selling out our culture and mythos? First, they offer that maybe we'll hire some people, but obviously they weren't going to, using this metric alone, tear us all out of poverty, right? You were never going to hire enough people such that you are able to, completely remove structural poverty. At best, it would be maybe 1 or 2 people, but you wouldn't even if you did that, you wouldn't hire them for that long. So it's unlikely that they'll be able to have sufficient long-lasting life out of that. And thirdly and finally, that we just didn't really believe that was a auntie jambing maker on the street was the type of person that they would hire. We felt if they're going to hire everyone from China to be already quite well-educated rich people. So to that extent, we just weren't quite clear how many people were they saving out of poverty in exchange for being able to auction off our culture. Unclear, right? Just having a few extra people on your consultation table wasn't probably enough for them to rip and tear, spit upon and trample the entire cultures of an entire people, often divorced from the continent that they were done. So what were you damaging in response to? I say that they have no response to. 1, the lockout of our own people from our own culture, which is a surprising thing that they just misunderstand because it's a characterization that I don't think they'd heard of before. So first, in their own analysis, when they tell us, we've got to attract better clientele, we've got to have cleanliness to attract more richer customers. And I think what that says to us is very telling, because I told you, it didn't just matter that people were able to sell the food, it also mattered that people of the culture were able to buy the food, right? So if all the sellers of the food suddenly made it all extremely, extremely expensive because they were catering to more higher priced people, that was also a lockout and appropriation of culture. That also meant that in exchange for every single person that you raised up as a result of this, you shut down a bunch of people who wanted to eat the food that they grew up with, who wanted those memories. And we told you that that was something we do not stand for. But the second thing that they did not, and I don't think did a really good response to, was they did nothing for a way that we told you that this was done by for a completely wrong purpose and done by for completely wrong people. We told you, first and foremost, that it didn't really matter if you were a Chinese American making Chinese food in a different way, to the point where you are trying to make it for a vastly different clientele, divorced and removed from the culture it was originally made from. You changed it. You made it completely different. And it meant that the evolution, rather than the natural evolution that occurred as we build it up over centuries suddenly take a vast left turn into higher quality ingredients and like weird bougie shit. And we think that that's wrong, and we think that people ought not celebrate that and should not have associated that with all of the traditional food that people love and think about. But the final thing that they don't really do a good job of is they don't analyze the very fundamental mechanisms that we told you about how this usurpation, what is in the common zeitgeist of what this food means, looks like, right? We told you, again, from my speech, that Michelin star restaurant recipes are going to be the ones who are followed more. We told you that when bougie kids come into the place and expect cleanliness and expect differences and expect to be able to sit down and eat with culture and fork, that changes the culture of the street food, which means that the street food is vastly different from the one that we left with, which meant that the people who valued that culture were left out in the cold, left unable to access what it wants. So at the end of this debate, I think, hey, if you want to be a debater and you want to defend these trypophobia-inducing nightmares of like nitrogen and pasta, go right ahead for it. We say we value that culture. And we say we value people's ability to connect with their own culture.
Thank you, Go4Play, for that speech, and that concludes the grand finals. Cross floor, shake hands. Good luck for the closing ceremony.